Hey guys, Jeffrey from Headstrong Training Systems here. So today we're going to be taking a look at the squat, and we're going to be taking a look at the impacts of different stance widths and different toe angles and the effect that has on our squat biomechanical movement pattern. So when we get right into it, and let's take a look at your stance width. We're looking at our stance width. When we're trying to decide our stance width, we can either have a more narrow and more closely in stance width, or we can also have a more wide apart stance width. Now we're going to be talking about the effects of being more narrow compared to being more wide. So when we start off with a more narrow stance width, we can tell that right now I'm in a more exaggerated sense, but the characteristics of a more narrow stance width involves that it means that we get a lot more knee travel, we become a lot more core dominant, and we also maintain a much more upright torso. So it's kind of emulating like a high bicycle movement pattern, where in this more position you can see that I can achieve a lot of knee travel forward, I can sink quite deep, and I can maintain quite an upright torso. So the characteristics of a more narrow squat stance. So the main characteristics of a more narrow squat stance involve a lot more knee travel and a lot more upright torso. Now, vice versa, if we start to space out our grip to a more medium stance, if we start to space out a stance to a more medium stance, you guys can see that with this squat pattern, less dominance is occurring throughout the knees and the quads, and we start to see that shift in our biomechanical movement pattern. We start to see the shift where we become more hip dominant during that squat movement pattern. And so if we go to even more extreme squat stance, even wider than before, you guys can probably imagine that in this squatting position, we become extremely hip dominant, and there's a lot of torso lean occurring in order to maintain neutrality. But essentially, with a much more wide squat stance, we become a lot more hip dominant. So why I'm presenting these characteristics of narrow versus wide squat stances to you guys is so that you guys yourself can make adjustments based on your own characteristics and your own needs. For example, if you find that you need to, for whatever reason, shift yourself into becoming more hip dominant, then opening your stance might be a way to do that. Now, next up, we're going to take a look at the toe angle. And so when I'm talking about toe angle, essentially I'm talking about our external internal rotation of our feet, so how wide we should have our toes pointed. So the main reason, or the main times where I might have an athlete look into turning their toe angle out is especially if they have a lot of long femurs. So if they have very long femurs and they're struggling to hit depth because their femurs have so much room to go, and there's no room for it to go anywhere. When we turn out our toe angle, what that means is it turns out our direction of travel as well. It turns out that angle, and so essentially it lengthens how much room we have from our starting position to that bottom position that the femur has access to. What I mean by that is, say I'm in a very toes pointed forward position, this will be my starting position where my hip is, and if I'm squatting down, you can see that this is the amount of displacement that needs to occur with that knee in order to get my femur down to depth. But as soon as I angle my toe out, you guys can see that now I've got an extra amount of displacement, an extra ROM that can occur. And so if you've got an athlete who's struggling to hit depth because they've got very long femurs, they may be turning their toe angle out. They'll allow them to sit more upright and to limit how much knee travel is occurring if, say, too much knee travel is causing problems. So that will allow them to still perform the squat movement, but by turning the toe angle out, you create an extra room for the femur to travel through. But on the flip side, the cons of turning your toe angle out, for some people, usually it means that they're less able to control their center of mass because that base of support of their foot is reduced when it's turned out, so they might lose their balance, and also it might be they might be putting them into a position where they're not as efficiently able to produce torque and able to produce power. So that's something, there are considerations to be made. But so usually with stance width, to kind of summarize the video today, usually with stance width, the more narrow you are, the more core dominant, the more knee dominant you are, and the vice versa is true with our wider stance. And if you're the toe angle, usually I'd say that pointed forward or even 5 to 10 degrees out is pretty efficient for most people. But if you are an athlete who's at extreme ranges where you're like very tall, have very long femurs, and you don't have the space for their femurs to go through, then maybe turning that toe angle out could be something that you look into. Also, depending on your bone structures, so your genetic makeup, if for whatever reason, if you haven't looked at your genetics, so like your hip anatomy, your bone structure there, and it's more advantageous for you to have your feet more externally rotated, and it allows you to sink into that socket better, allows you to sink to depth better, then that could also be a reason that you potentially explore turning your toe angle out. So that's all for me today, guys. Hope that's helpful for you, and I'll catch you guys next time. Take care.